The first thing anyone noticed about the Duke of Kestrel Chase was the silence that surrounded him. It was not a peaceful quiet, but a hard, watchful stillness, as if the air itself held its breath in his presence. Society, which thrived on noise, found this deeply unsettling. It was this silence that filled the assembly rooms in Maryvale, a palpable weight that pressed the chatter down to a murmur. From her half-hidden alcove behind a wilting potted fern, Constance Bellamy watched him. She had been tasked by her aunt, Lady Arabella Farrow, with ensuring the lemonade bowl remained full, and that no one saw the tiny, meticulous darn she had stitched into the hem of her cousin Lavinia's gown. It was her usual role, invisible, functional, and entirely unpaid. Constance was 24, an age at which society deemed a woman either a triumphant wife or a permanent fixture in a relative's drawing room. With no dowry and a countenance more sensible than striking, her fate had long been sealed. She was the family ledger, the family mender, the family memory. Her mind was a steel trap of figures, dates, and obligations, her aunt's obligations, never her own. Her hands, though slender, were perpetually stained with a faint trace of ink at the fingertips. She had long ago learned that competence, in a woman of her position, was not a virtue to be celebrated, but a utility to be exploited. "He is looking for a wife, you know," Lavinia whispered, fanning herself with a frantic rhythm that threatened to undo the delicate pearl embroidery on her glove, embroidery Constance had spent a week repairing. "They say he has a test." "A test?" Constance murmured, her eyes still on the Duke. Gideon Devereux. He stood near the hearth, a man carved from granite and shadow, his dark hair untouched by powder, his coat a severe, perfect black. He had not smiled once. "Yes," Lavinia breathed, her eyes wide. "Some trial of loyalty. Philippa Ingram says he presents each prospective lady with a dilemma, a secret choice, to see if she is trustworthy. No one knows what it is, of course, but Philippa is certain she shall pass. She has been practicing her expressions of unwavering devotion in the mirror." Constance almost smiled. Philippa Ingram, with her polished charm and her father's formidable wealth, was the county's reigning belle. She saw the Duke not as a man, but as the ultimate prize, the key to a social kingdom. Constance watched as Philippa approached him now, a vision in silk the color of a summer sky. She curtsied, her voice a musical cascade of practiced flattery. The Duke inclined his head, his expression unreadable. He said something, one short sentence, and Miss Ingram's perfect smile faltered for a fraction of a second before recovering. He had already dismissed her, though he remained standing before her. Aunt Arabella glided over to them, a shark in watered silk. "Constance, the punch is nearly empty. Do make yourself useful. And for heaven's sake, try not to look so diligent. It is most unbecoming." Constance simply nodded and moved towards the refreshment table. It was here that her world tilted on its axis. A small group of local squires were loudly debating the cost of the new enclosure acts. Mr. Carmichael, a man whose confidence far outstripped his intellect, was holding forth. "And the Duke's steward tells me the yield from the north pasture will increase by 50%. A brilliant stroke of management." 50%? A quieter man, Mr. Ellery, murmured. "That seems optimistic. The soil is too thin for wheat." "Nonsense," Carmichael boomed. "The Duke's own figures prove it. I saw the prospectus myself." Constance paused, her hand on the silver ladle. She knew those figures. Her aunt, ever eager to appear knowledgeable, had borrowed a copy of the Kestrel Chase estate plans. Constance had been tasked with summarizing them. Her memory, precise and unforgiving, served up the numbers instantly. The prospectus had projected a 15% increase, 1.5, and even that was contingent on a costly lime treatment for the acidic soil. 50% was not optimistic. It was a fantasy. She should have said nothing. It was not her place. Her place was by the wilting fern, invisible and silent. But honesty, like a well-balanced ledger, was a principle she could not bring herself to compromise. Quietly, so that only the men in the immediate circle could hear, she said, "Forgive me, Mr. Carmichael. I believe the projection was for a 15% increase, and it required a significant outlay for soil improvement." The men turned. Carmichael's face mottled with fury at being corrected by a nobody, a plain girl in a drab gray dress. "And what would you know of it, miss?" "I read the prospectus," she answered simply. Her voice did not tremble. "Page 7, subsection B. The cost of the lime was estimated at £200 per acre." There was a stunned silence. Mr. Ellery blinked at her, a flicker of respect in his eyes. Before Carmichael could unleash the torrent of indignation brewing in his chest, a low voice cut through the air from behind her. "She is correct." Constance froze. She did not need to turn to know who had spoken. The silence that followed was absolute. Gideon Devereux, the Duke of Kestrel Chase, had moved from the hearth without a sound. He stood there, his dark eyes fixed not on the red-faced Carmichael, but on her. "The figure was 15%, the Duke stated. It was not an opinion, it was a fact being laid on the table. The cost was precise. £200. He looked at Constance, and for the first time she felt truly seen. It was not a pleasant sensation. It was like being examined by a scientist, every detail noted, every flaw catalogued. There was no warmth in his gaze, only a cold, penetrating assessment. He was not looking at her as a woman. He was looking at her as a source of accurate data. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod. Then he turned and walked away, the hushed crowd parting before him as if he were royalty from a colder, harsher kingdom. Aunt Arabella descended upon Constance, her fingers digging into her arm like talons. "What have you done?" she hissed, her face a mask of fury. "You have made a spectacle of yourself, arguing with gentlemen, quoting figures like some sort of clerk. You have ruined everything for Lavinia." Constance said nothing. She looked down at her hands, at the faint, ineradicable stain of ink on her right forefinger. She had not been trying to ruin anything. She had simply told the truth. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. They were just another column in the ledger, an expense with no return. She glanced back towards the door where the Duke had departed. For a man surrounded by silence, he had left a profound echo in his wake. And in that echo, for the first time in a very long time, Constance Bellamy felt something other than resignation. It was not hope. It was something harder and much more frightening. A possibility. The summons came 2 days later. A footman in the severe black and grey livery of Kestrel Chase delivered a single, thick card to Lady Farrow's modest townhouse. It was not an invitation to a ball or a dinner. It was a request, a command, really, for Miss Constance Bellamy to attend the Duke at his estate at 10 o'clock the following morning. Aunt Arabella was thrown into a state of bewildered agitation. "It must be a mistake," she declared, turning the card over and over, as if seeking a hidden addendum. "He means Lavinia, surely. The man is a duke, but he must be half-blind." "The card says my name, Aunt," Constance said calmly, continuing to mend a tear in one of the household linens. Her stitches were small and even, almost invisible. "He means to offer you a position," Arabella decided, her eyes gleaming with a new, avaricious light. "A governess, perhaps, or a companion for some ancient aunt." "Excellent! A good salary, which of course you will share with the family that has so generously sheltered you." Constance did not reply. She knew the Duke had no ancient aunt. She knew, because she had read the peerage entry, that he was the last of his line. He had returned from the war on the continent a year ago to inherit a title, a vast and neglected estate, and, according to rumour, a grief as cold and unyielding as the granite hills of his home. The next morning, she dressed in her best gown, a simple dark blue wool that had been her mother's. It was serviceable, respectable, and utterly devoid of fashion. Her aunt insisted Lavinia accompany her, dressed in a confection of pale pink muslin, just in case the Duke came to his senses. The journey to Kestrel Chase was made in a hired carriage that rattled over the poorly maintained roads leading out of Merivale. As they passed through the great stone gates of the estate, the grandeur was immediately apparent. But it was a grandeur in decay. The parklands were overgrown, the magnificent oaks choked with ivy. The house itself, a sprawling Jacobean masterpiece, seemed to hunch under the grey sky, its many windows like vacant eyes. They were shown into a library that smelled of leather, beeswax, and something else, a faint, sharp scent of disuse. Books overflowed the shelves, stacked in precarious towers on the floor. A thick layer of dust covered every surface except for a single, massive desk. And behind it sat Gideon Devereux. He rose as they entered. He gave Lavinia a cursory nod, his gaze dismissing her pretty, hopeful face in an instant. Then his eyes settled on Constance, and the full weight of his attention was unnerving. "Miss Bellamy, thank you for coming." "Your Grace," she murmured, curtsying. He gestured to a chair opposite his desk. "Please." He did not invite Lavinia or a hovering Lady Farrow to sit. The dismissal was absolute. Her aunt, fuming, steered Lavinia from the room, leaving Constance alone with the Duke. For a long moment, he simply studied her. She sat with her back straight, her hands folded in her lap, and met his gaze without flinching. She would not be intimidated. She had faced down her aunt's rages and the condescension of 100 drawing rooms. This silent man held no new terrors for her. Finally, he spoke. His voice was low and devoid of inflection. "I require a Duchess." Constance blinked. Of all the things she had expected, a lecture, a job offer, a dismissal, this was not among them. I see, Your Grace." "I have no time for the rituals of courtship," he continued, his hands resting flat on the polished wood of his desk. "They are inefficient and based on falsehoods. I am not looking for a love match. I am looking for a partner. This estate is in chaos. My accounts are a disaster. The staff is undisciplined. The tenants are neglected. My social obligations have been ignored for a year. I need someone to manage the domestic and social spheres of Kestrel Chase, so that I may focus on restoring the agricultural and financial foundations." He paused, his eyes boring into hers. "At the assembly, you demonstrated a capacity for two qualities I find exceedingly rare: an accurate memory and a willingness to speak the truth, even when it is inconvenient. I value evidence over charm, Miss Bellamy. I value competence over beauty." He was offering her a contract, a position. The title of Duchess was merely the name of the role. She felt a strange, cold clarity settle over her. "You are proposing marriage, Your Grace?" "I am," he said. "The terms are these. You will have complete authority over the household, the staff, and all social arrangements. You will be provided with a personal allowance of £5,000 per annum, to be disposed of as you see fit. You will have my name, my protection, and my respect. In return, I require your absolute honesty in all matters, your discretion, and your proficient management of your duties. Our lives will be largely separate. I expect you to provide an heir, in time. Beyond that, your time will be your own. It is a business arrangement, nothing more." He was testing her, not with some silly, romantic dilemma, but with the cold, hard reality of his proposition. He was testing her pragmatism, her lack of sentimentality. He expected her to be flattered, or shocked, or to bargain. Constance thought of her life with Aunt Arabella. She thought of the endless, thankless tasks, the constant belittling, the ink-stained fingers, and the aching back. She thought of a future stretching out before her, a long, grey road of servitude disguised as family obligation. And then she thought of Kestrel Chase, a broken, neglected place that needed managing. She thought of overflowing books and dusty ledgers. It was a problem to be solved, a system to be ordered. It was work she knew how to do. She looked him directly in the eye. "The terms are acceptable, Your Grace." A flicker of something, surprise, respect, passed through his cold eyes. "You have no questions, no desire to consider?" "My consideration is complete," she said. "I have one condition." "Which is?" "My aunt, Lady Farrow, is not to be a guest in this house. Ever." For the first time since she had met him, the corner of Gideon Devereux's mouth tilted, in what might, on another man, have been a smile. "That term," he said, "is also acceptable." He stood and extended a hand across the desk. It was not a lover's gesture. It was the sealing of a deal. She placed her hand in his. His grip was firm, cool, and brief. "Welcome to Kestrel Chase, Miss Bellamy." "Thank you, Your Grace," she replied. "In private," he said, releasing her hand, "you will call me Gideon, and I shall call you Constance. We must maintain the appearance of a successful partnership." Constance. No one had called her by her full name in years. She was Connie to her aunt, a name always delivered with a sigh of exasperation. Hearing her own name, spoken in his low, quiet voice, felt like the first entry in a new, clean ledger. The first day of her new employment. The wedding was a quiet, perfunctory affair at the village church in Merivale, attended only by a handful of bewildered locals and a grim-faced Lady Farrow, who could not decide whether to be furious at Constance's elevation or ecstatic at the prospect of claiming a ducal connection. Lavinia looked at Constance with a strange mix of envy and pity. Philippa Ingram did not attend, but sent a note of congratulations so saccharine it could have frosted a cake. Immediately after the ceremony, Gideon handed her into his carriage, and they began the journey to Kestrel Chase in a silence that was thick with unspoken terms. This was her new life. She was now the Duchess of Kestrel Chase. But as the carriage rattled through the gates, she felt less like a bride and more like a new steward arriving to take up a challenging post. Her first encounter with the staff confirmed her assessment. They were assembled in the great hall, a collection of wary, resentful faces, led by a housekeeper whose posture was as stiff as her starched grey dress. "Your Grace," the woman said, her voice clipped and cold.
I am Mrs. Draycott. I have been housekeeper at Kestrel Chase for 30 years. The unspoken addendum was clear. I have seen your kind before, and I will see you go. Constance looked at the assembled staff. She saw the sloppy livery on the footmen, the worn-out shoes on the maids, the faint air of hopelessness that clung to them all. She did not give a grand speech. She did not make promises. She simply met Mrs. Draycott's gaze. "Mrs. Draycott," she said, her voice clear and calm, "I will require the household account books for the past 5 years, the staff rosters, and the keys to the linen closets and the still room."
"By noon, if you please." A murmur went through the staff. Mrs. Draycott's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. She had expected tears, or tantrums, or timid requests. She had not expected a quiet, direct order for the very tools of household power.
"As you wish, Your Grace."
Constance spent the first week in the estate office, a small, cold room adjoining the library. She did not venture into the grand saloons or the dusty bedrooms. She sat with the ledgers and with Gideon. He would work at his great desk in the library, she at her smaller one in the office, the door between them left open. They rarely spoke, but a strange, silent companionship formed in that shared space. She would occasionally ask him a question.
"Was the contract with the London wine merchant for port or claret in 1812?
And he would answer without looking up, his voice a low rumble. "Claret. The port was from a private cellar in Oporto." He was beginning to realize the scope of her memory. She was beginning to realize the depth of his neglect. The books were a nightmare. Tradesmen had been underpaid or overpaid or not paid at all. Inventories were years out of date. Contracts were missing. It was a fortress that had been allowed to crumble from within. Constance started not by giving orders, but by asking questions. She spoke to the head groom about the cost of oats, to the cook about the waste from the kitchens, to the maids about the supply of beeswax and soap. She listened, and she remembered everything. Her first true challenge was Mrs. Draycott. The housekeeper watched her with undisguised suspicion. She fulfilled Constance's requests to the letter, but with a frigid precision that was a form of defiance. The turning point came in the third week, in the main linen closet. It was a vast, cedar-lined room, but the contents were in chaos. Damask tablecloths were yellowing, sheets were torn, and a faint smell of mildew hung in the air. Constance stood in the middle of the room, a small notebook in her hand.
"Mrs. Draycott," she said quietly, "the lavender bundles have lost their scent, and this stack of linens has moth damage."
"The house is large, Your Grace," the housekeeper replied stiffly. "One cannot be everywhere."
"No," Constance agreed. "One cannot, which is why a system is necessary."
For the next 3 days, Constance worked alongside the junior maids in that closet. She did not command them. She showed them. She taught them the precise way to fold a sheet, how to layer the lavender, how to spot the first signs of fabric decay. She recorded every single item in her notebook. Her hands, soft from years of letter writing, became chapped and sore. Mrs. Draycott watched from the doorway, her arms crossed, her face a mask of disapproval. On the 4th day, Constance found what she was looking for, tucked away at the back of a deep shelf. A small, exquisitely embroidered trousseau of baby linens, wrapped in silk paper. They were for the heir that Gideon's first wife, who had died within a year of their marriage, had never conceived. They were pristine, but a single, faint brown spot of mildew marred one tiny gown. Constance carried it out. She found Mrs. Draycott in her sitting room. Without a word, she laid the tiny gown on the table. The housekeeper looked at it.
and her iron composure finally cracked. A single, difficult tear traced a path down her wrinkled cheek. "I did not know," she whispered. "I thought them safe." "The damp in the north wall is getting worse," Constance said gently. "We will need to have the masons look at it. But I believe we can save this. A solution of lemon juice and salt left in the sun." It was not pity in her voice. It was practical compassion. Mrs. Draycott looked from the gown to the new Duchess, this quiet, plain woman who had spent days doing a housemaid's work. She saw the chapped hands, the smudge of dust on her cheek, and the clear, unwavering intelligence in her eyes.
"Yes, Your Grace," she said, her voice thick. "I shall see to it at once." From that day on, Hannah Draycott was Constance's unwavering ally. The loyalty dominoes had begun to fall. The cook found her requests for new kitchen equipment were not only approved, but accompanied by questions about which supplier offered the best quality copper. The stable master discovered the new Duchess knew the difference between hay and straw, and had allocated funds for a new roof on the stables before the winter rains. The house began to breathe again. The symbol of this quiet revival was the herb garden. Tucked away behind the kitchens, it had been the pride of Gideon's mother. Now it was a tangled mess of weeds and dying rosemary. Constance began to spend an hour there every morning, after she had reviewed the daily accounts. With her own hands, she cleared the weeds, turned the soil, and carefully pruned the surviving plants. She found old seeds in the potting shed and planted them. Thyme, sage, mint, chamomile. It was practical work, but it was also a reclamation. She was not just restoring a garden, she was cultivating a home. Gideon watched all of this from the windows of his library. He said nothing, but he noticed. He noticed the scent of beeswax replacing the smell of dust. He noticed the quiet efficiency of the staff. He noticed the food at his solitary dinners tasted brighter, seasoned with fresh herbs. He saw his wife, his Duchess, kneeling in the dirt, her brow furrowed in concentration, and felt a stirring of something he had long believed dead. It was not love. It was something harder and more respectful. It was recognition. One evening, he came into the estate office to find her asleep at her desk, her head resting on an open ledger, the flickering candlelight catching the ink stain on her finger. A lock of her simple brown hair had fallen across her cheek. Without thinking, he reached out and gently tucked it behind her ear. Her skin was soft. He withdrew his hand as if burned, a strange confusion warring with the cold numbness that had been his constant companion for years. He returned to his library, but he could not concentrate. The silent contract they had made was being complicated by an unwritten clause, an emotion he had no column for in his own internal ledger. The first whispers from Merivale reached Kestrel Chase like a foul miasma. Carried by gossiping callers and insinuating letters, they were crafted by the twin furies of a spurned Philippa Ingram and a vengeful Lady Arabella Farrow. At first, they were mere snubs. The new Duchess was so plain, so provincial. She had no taste, no style. She dressed in drab colors and spent her days counting spoons like a common housekeeper. When these barbs failed to find their mark, largely because Constance never heard them and would not have cared if she had, the attacks grew sharper. She was an opportunist, they said, who had trapped the grieving Duke with some sort of cunning trick. She was isolating him, turning him against his old friends. And then, the most dangerous lie of all began to circulate. She was mismanaging the estate. Tales were spun of lavish personal expenditures, of funds being diverted, of old family treasures being sold off in secret. Philippa, with her social grace, planted the seeds of doubt in the drawing rooms of the county, while Lady Arabella, with her intimate knowledge of Constance's past, provided the venomous details. "Poor girl," she would sigh to anyone who would listen. "She never understood the value of money. Always had her head in a book, never in the real world." Constance was vaguely aware of the cooling attitudes of her few county neighbors, but she was too busy to pay it much mind. She was organizing the tenants' Christmas ball, negotiating a better price for slate from the Welsh quarries, and overseeing the restoration of the West Wing. Her world was Kestrel Chase, and it was a world she was slowly, methodically bringing back to life. The attack, when it came, was direct and brutal. It arrived in the form of a letter delivered to Gideon by a smirking Mr. Carmichael, who had clearly been enlisted as a willing courier. The letter was purportedly from a London jeweler demanding payment of £2,000 for a diamond necklace. Enclosed was a bill of sale dated 3 weeks prior, signed shakily but recognizably with the name Constance Devereux. Gideon sat at his desk for a full hour, the documents spread before him. £2,000. It was a staggering sum. He looked at the signature. It was close, very close, to his wife's neat, precise hand. He thought of the quiet woman in the next room. He thought of her chapped hands and her simple gowns. He thought of her poring over the ledgers, saving pennies on beeswax and candles. A diamond necklace? It made no sense. And yet, he had been betrayed before. His first marriage had been a disaster of deceit and hidden debts, a wound that had never truly healed. The old, cold suspicion coiled in his gut. Trust was a fool's game. Evidence was all that mattered. He walked into the estate office. Constance was at her desk, a small frown of concentration on her face as she reconciled the quarterly accounts. She looked up as he entered, her expression clearing into one of neutral inquiry. "Gideon," she said, "is something amiss?" He did not answer. He simply placed the jeweler's letter and the bill of sale on the desk in front of her. He did not accuse. He did not yell. He uttered 2 words, his voice flat and hard as slate. "Explain this." Constance looked down at the papers. She read the letter, her expression unchanging. She picked up the bill of sale and studied it, her eyes missing no detail. The silence in the room stretched, thin and sharp. This was it. The crisis. The true test he had never intended to set. A test of the fragile, unspoken trust that had grown between them in the quiet rooms of his broken house. He watched her, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest, waiting for the tears, the denials, the hysterics he remembered from his past. She did none of those things. She set the bill down carefully. She looked up at him, and her eyes were not fearful, but analytical. "It is a forgery," she said, her voice perfectly calm. "A convincing one," he countered, his own voice clipped. "No," she said, a hint of steel in her tone. "It is a clumsy one. There are 3 errors. First," she tapped a finger on the paper, "the stationer's watermark. It is for a paper mill in Kent. I purchase all our household stationery from a supplier in London whose paper comes from a mill in Hertfordshire. I have the receipts. Second," she pointed to the signature, "the C in Constance is slightly too ornate. It is how my cousin Lavinia was taught to form her letters at finishing school. My own is plainer. Third, and most importantly, the date.
3 weeks ago, on the 15th of October. On that day, you and I were at Netherby Grove all day, inspecting the new drainage system with the steward. We did not return until after 9 in the evening. There are at least 10 members of staff who can attest to it. I could not possibly have been in a London jeweler's shop. She delivered the information with the dispassionate precision of an auditor presenting a report. It was a devastating, methodical demolition of the lie. She did not plead for his belief. She presented him with facts, evidence, the very coin of the realm he claimed to value above all else. A great, shuddering breath he hadn't realized he was holding escaped Gideon's lungs. The cold knot of suspicion in his gut dissolved, replaced by a hot, shameful wave of self-recrimination. He had doubted her. For a moment, he had allowed the ghosts of his past to blind him to the truth of the woman standing before him.
He looked at her, truly looked at her steady hands, her clear eyes, her quiet dignity, and he felt a profound, aching sense of awe. She was not loyal because she had passed a test. She was loyal because it was the very fabric of her being. Her integrity was as real and unyielding as the granite of Kestrel Chase itself. "I see," he said, his voice rough. He reached out and pushed the forged documents into a single, damning pile. "This was not the work of a London jeweler." "No," she agreed quietly. "The demand for payment was sent to Mr. Carmichael, not directly to you. He has never been a friend to this house. And the handwriting on the address, it has certain affectations, a particular way of looping the F. My Aunt Arabella has used that same loop in every letter she has written for 20 years. It was all there. A conspiracy of spite and greed, orchestrated by her aunt and Philippa Ingram, using Lavinia's hand for the signature and Carmichael as their pawn. Gideon felt a cold, precise rage settle over him. They had not just attacked his wife. They had attacked his house. They had used lies to strike at the one person who was healing it with truth. "They will not get away with it," he said. It was not a promise. It was a statement of intent. Constance simply nodded. She picked up her pen and turned back to the ledger, dipping it in the ink pot. Her hand was perfectly steady. The crisis was over. The work remained. But something fundamental had shifted between them. The open door between their offices was no longer just a convenience. It was a symbol of a trust that had been tested by fire and had not broken. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. Gideon began to plan the dinner party that very afternoon. It would not be a grand ball, but an intimate gathering. An execution, staged in his own dining room. The guest list was small and specific. Lady Arabella Farrow and her daughter Lavinia, Miss Philippa Ingram and her father, Mr. Carmichael, and, for the role of chief witness, the formidable Dowager Countess Lady Rosamond Trent. Lady Trent was a woman whose sharp tongue and sharper mind were the terror of the county. Her judgment, once passed, was irrevocable. Constance moved through the preparations with her usual quiet efficiency. She consulted with the cook on the menu, approved the floral arrangements, and ensured the silver was polished to a brilliant shine. She showed no sign of agitation or triumph. To any observer, she was simply a duchess preparing for a social engagement. Only Gideon saw the subtle tension in the set of her shoulders, the unwavering focus in her eyes. They were partners in this, moving with a silent, synchronized purpose.
The evening arrived, cold and clear. The guests assembled in the newly refurbished drawing room, a picture of polished wood and warm candlelight. Lady Arabella was resplendent in a ghastly shade of purple, her conversation a stream of veiled insults aimed at the simplicity of Kestrel Chase's decor. Philippa Ingram was a vision in pale green silk, her manner towards Gideon a cloying mix of sympathy and flirtation. "Your Grace, you have been so isolated here. We have all been so worried for you." Gideon was a model of cold civility. He guided his guests into the dining room, seating Lady Trent at his right and Constance at the head of the long, candlelit table, in her rightful place as Duchess. The first two courses proceeded with a tense, brittle politeness. Lady Trent watched everyone from beneath her hooded eyelids, her silence more damning than any pronouncement. It was after the main course was cleared that Gideon made his move. He did not rise. He did not raise his voice. He simply placed his folded hands on the table and spoke into the expectant silence. "Mr. Carmichael," he began, his voice dangerously soft, "you were kind enough to bring me a document several days ago."
A matter of some urgency, you claimed. Carmichael, who had been boasting of his new hunter, choked on his port.
Yes, Your Grace. A distasteful business. I felt it my duty."
"Indeed," Gideon said, his eyes like chips of ice. "A bill for a diamond necklace, allegedly purchased by my wife." He produced the forged documents from a folder beside his chair and laid them on the table. A collective gasp went around the room. Philippa's fan stilled. Lady Arabella's face went rigid. Constance sat perfectly still, her eyes on her husband. "An interesting document," Gideon continued, his voice conversational. "My wife, however, is a woman of meticulous habits. She was able to point out several inconsistencies." He then proceeded, with the cold precision of a surgeon, to lay out the evidence Constance had shown him. The Hertfordshire watermark, the discrepancy in the signature, and the alibi. "On the 15th of October, he said, his gaze sweeping the table, "my wife and I were at Netherby Grove until after 9 o'clock. I have sworn statements to that effect from my steward, my coachman, and 3 tenant farmers we spoke with that day." He produced a second sheaf of papers and placed them next to the first. "So, you see, a mystery presents itself. How could my wife be in 2 places at once?" The silence was thick enough to cut with a knife. Mr. Carmichael was sweating profusely, his face the color of old parchment. Gideon's eyes landed on Lavinia. The girl was pale as a ghost, her eyes wide with terror. "Miss Farrow," he said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly, "the signature on this bill is a very good imitation of my wife's, but the capital C, it is rather more flamboyant, more like a letter formed by a young lady taught to value style over substance. Would you agree?" Lavinia let out a small, strangled sob and looked at her mother. Lady Arabella shot her a look of pure venom. "The Duke is mistaken," she said, her voice high and brittle. "My daughter knows nothing of this." "Doesn't she?" It was Lady Trent who spoke, her voice a dry rasp. She leaned forward, her shrewd old eyes fixing on Philippa Ingram. "And you, Miss Ingram, you have been very vocal in your concern for the Kestrel Chase finances. One might almost think you had a personal interest in seeing the new Duchess discredited." Philippa's practiced composure finally shattered. "I only repeated what I heard," she snapped. "Everyone was saying it." "Were they?" Gideon murmured. "Or were you the one saying it? My butler has an excellent memory for conversations overheard in this house, as does my wife's maid." They have both remarked upon the consistency of the rumors and their source. He let the word hang in the air. He then picked up the final piece of evidence, the envelope the bill had arrived in. And then there is the matter of the address, written in a hand that I am told is quite distinctive. Lady Pharaoh, he said, turning the full force of his cold fury upon her. My wife informs me you have a particular fondness for an elaborate loop on your capital F. Just like this. He slid the envelope across the table. It stopped directly in front of her plate. Lady Arabella stared at it as if it were a snake. The trap had closed. Every escape route was cut off. There was no room for lies, no space for denial. There was only the quiet, irrefutable evidence laid bare on the polished mahogany. It was over. Mr. Carmichael began to babble apologies. Philippa Ingram burst into tears, and Lady Arabella Pharaoh, for the first time in her life, was struck completely, utterly silent. She stared at Constance, her face a mask of disbelief and hatred. She had underestimated the quiet girl who balanced her ledgers. She had mistaken competence for weakness and silence for stupidity. It was a fatal error. Lady Trent delivered the final verdict. She rose slowly from her chair, her gaze sweeping over the disgraced conspirators.
Well, she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent room. This has been a most illuminating dinner. Devereux, your wife is a credit to you. As for the rest of you, she looked at Arabella and Philippa, I find my appetite has quite deserted me. Merivale society, I suspect, will shortly feel the same. She gave a crisp nod to Gideon and Constance, and then, with the air of a queen departing a slum, she swept from the room. Her departure broke the spell. The Ingrams and Carmichael practically fled, their exit a chaos of shame and fear. Lady Arabella remained frozen, until Lavinia, weeping, pulled at her arm. Mother, we must go. As they were leaving, Lavinia paused at the door. She looked back at her cousin, at the woman she had always viewed with a mixture of pity and disdain. Constance, she whispered, her voice choked with tears. I am so sorry. It was a small, imperfect apology, born of fear as much as remorse. But Constance accepted it with a quiet nod. She would not forgive. Not yet. But she understood. Lavinia was not evil, merely weak, a pawn in her mother's cruel games. The door closed, leaving Constance and Gideon alone in the wreckage of their dinner party. The candles still burned brightly, the silver still gleamed. But the air was finally clear. The poison had been drawn. Later that night, Gideon found her in the herb garden. A full moon bathed the neat, orderly rows in a silvery light. The air was cool and fragrant with the scent of thyme and damp earth. She was standing by the rosemary bush, her arms wrapped around herself, not from cold, but as if to hold herself together after the ordeal. He stood beside her, not touching, respecting the space between them. The silence that had once been a barrier now felt like a shared language. It is done, he said. Yes, she answered, her voice quiet. He turned to face her. Constance, when I saw that letter, for a moment I doubted you. It was a confession, stark and unadorned. The failures of my past are a heavy burden. I apologize. There is no need, she said, looking up at him. In the moonlight, her sensible face was transformed into something of rare and quiet beauty. You did not accuse. You asked for an explanation. You waited for the evidence. That is more than anyone has ever given me." He saw it then. The strength he had mistaken for mere competence, the resilience he had labeled as pragmatism. It was not a business arrangement he wanted with this woman. It was everything. He did something he had never done, something the cold, guarded Duke of Kestrel Chase would have thought impossible. He went down on one knee before her, there on the damp earth of the garden she had brought back to life. He took her hand, her capable, ink-stained, soil-smudged hand in his. "Constance Bellamy," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he could no longer name or contain. "When I asked you to marry me, I offered you a contract. I was a fool. I did not know what I was asking, or of whom. I did not offer you my heart, because I did not believe I had one left to give. You have proven me wrong. You have brought order to my house, but you have brought life back to me." He looked up at her, his proud, guarded face stripped bare of all artifice. "I am not asking you to fulfill a contract. I am asking you to be my wife, in truth. To share my life, not just my name. To choose me, as I now, and for all my days, choose you." Tears, which she had refused to shed in humiliation or anger, now welled in Constance's eyes. They were not tears of sadness, but of a profound, overwhelming relief. The final column in the ledger of her life had finally been balanced. "Yes," she whispered, her hand tightening on his. "Yes, Gideon. Plainly. Together." He rose and drew her into his arms. And there, in the quiet of the moonlit garden, he kissed his wife for the first time. It was not a kiss of passion, but of recognition, a promise, sealed not with words, but with a truth that was finally, blessedly, shared. 2 years later, the light that filled Kestrel Chase was warm and golden. It streamed through the clean panes of the library windows, illuminating the dust-free air and the books that now stood in orderly ranks upon their shelves. The silence that surrounded the Duke was no longer a hard, watchful stillness, but a companionable peace. He sat in a worn leather armchair by the fire, reading a treatise on crop rotation. Across from him, Constance, the Duchess of Kestrel Chase, was not darning or balancing ledgers. She was sketching a design for a new glass house in a handsome leather-bound notebook. Her hands were no longer stained with ink. Today they bore a faint, clean smudge of earth on the knuckles from her morning's work in the garden. The herb garden was now a marvel, a fragrant, thriving heart at the center of the estate, its bounty supplying not only their own kitchens, but half the apothecaries in Maryvale. The door opened, and Mrs. Draycott entered, bearing a silver tray with tea and biscuits. Her movements were no longer stiff with resentment, but imbued with a fond, protective warmth. She had become Constance's staunchest defender and most trusted confidant. "Your Grace," she said, her smile genuine. "Lady Trent has just arrived. Shall I show her in here?" "Please, Hannah," Constance replied, looking up from her drawing. The easy use of the housekeeper's first name spoke volumes of the transformation within those walls. Lady Rosamond Trent swept in, as formidable as ever, but her sharp eyes softened as she took in the scene of domestic tranquility. "Well, Devereux," she announced, settling herself into a chair without invitation. "You don't look nearly so much like a haunted gargoyle these days. Marriage appears to agree with you." Gideon actually smiled, a genuine, easy expression that reached his eyes. "It is not marriage that agrees with me, Rosamond. It is my wife."
He reached across and placed his hand over Constance's, his touch both a casual affection and a profound statement. Constance's fingers laced with his. She thought for a moment of the girl in the gray dress who had stood behind a wilting fern, invisible and overlooked. She thought of the cold, pragmatic contract she had accepted as an escape. It had not been an escape. It had been a beginning. She had not been chosen because she passed a test. She had been chosen because she had refused to be tested at all, offering instead the simple, unadorned truth of who she was. And in that truth, she had found not just a home, but a love more real and enduring than any romantic fantasy. Her gaze fell upon the windowsill, where a single, perfect sprig of rosemary sat in a small silver cup, filling the warm air with its scent of remembrance and fidelity. The house was whole. The garden was thriving. And so was she. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.